Number 10. DC offset voltage was a modulator used in early modular synthesizers for a variety of purposes. It simply provided a steady voltage and often had a knob to manually set the level. As one example, it could be split off to give a manual adjustment to several modules simultaneously. We can use it to boost several functions beyond their normal maximum limits. In creating this function on our synthesizers, the best way is not to use an envelope, which might seem the obvious choice, but an LFO instead. Envelopes always go back down to the 0 level sooner or later when you release the key, but the LFOs can remain constant after key release. Set the LFO frequency to 0, and reset to on, so that it stays at its initial L1 level, forever. The square wave is the traditional choice here, but sawtooth works as well since it also begins at its maximum level. And for something extra, keep in mind that you can use any LFO as its own modulator to get a 50% additional boost out of it. Bloody brilliant! Ordinary Ensoniq players' LFO levels only go up to 63, but ours can, in effect, go up to 94.5. Eat that spinal tap! Now, as a side application of this, if you set the LFO level to 0, any modulator you send through it will come out the other side reduced to 50% of its original adjustment range, or even less if you send it through more than one LFO sequentially. I've actually found that to be useful in patches where more subtle adjustments are preferred in polite society. But, this only works with positive modulations like you get from the mod wheel or mod pedal. The LFOs always completely ignore any and all negative modulation values, like you can get from envelopes and LFO waveforms other than square. Don't ask me why, I think that's just a big pile of snot. Here's an example of what the DC offset voltage can do to boost the amplitude of the digital waveforms going into the analog section of the signal chain, for a little bit of real analog overdrive distortion. The owner's manual warns against doing this, but we don't care, we're a bunch of rowdy ruffians. In this example, all three oscillators have the organ waveform, which is one of the louder ones, and all their DCAs are maxed out to 63. Then I use LFO1 to DC offset the DCAs and boost them up even further, which overdrives the input to the analog filter. One way to get slightly alternate versions of waveforms, or to just change the sample split note a bit, is done through sample shifting. Here's a patch that has 3 vocal waveforms, and 2 of them are tuned a couple of notes off pitch. Then I'm using the DC offset voltage to shift the pitch back. Now each oscillator has a different split key, which makes the split harder to detect. Compare the before and after. The SQ-80's 3 glint waveforms are all automatically stuck really high up in pitch and cannot be tuned any lower. You can huff and puff to blow your pitch down, but nothing happens. Plus each one just stays right around one note no matter what keys you play. What odd waveforms! But in this unauthorized patch using sample shifting, all 3 glint waveforms are forced several octaves lower in pitch by the DC offset modulator to create an organ patch, where each oscillator keeps changing notes and tones every few keys, and completely circles back around every 2 octaves. Another Mondo nifty trick is to sample shift the resonant waveforms to change their center frequency to some other frequency. You get to choose which. You may have noticed, especially on the traditional analog waveforms, how our Ensoniqs have a pre-filtering effect progressively added as you go higher in pitch. That's because our lower fidelity digital waves will otherwise go into foul and cruel digital distortion in the higher frequencies where aliasing awaits you all with nasty big pointy teeth. Our synthesizers automatically switch to more rounded and less bright versions of the original waveform, gradually ending up as sine waves at the very highest possible pitches. But here's an example that extends the full brightness of the sawtooth 1 octave higher than Ensoniq intended. It's not a huge difference, but it can contribute positively to the sound. First, tune the oscillator down 1 octave too low for your patch. Make sure the DC offset LFO is turned up to 50 at L1. As long as the delay time is set to 0, it doesn't matter what L2 is. Then back at the oscillator, use the LFO as one of the pitch modulators with a value of plus 63. That brings it back up an octave to the correct pitch for the patch. But now that the waveform is sample shifted, it stays brighter an octave higher up the keyboard and Bob's your uncle. In your face, Ensoniq. Try it for yourself and see if you think it sounds any more distorted this way. Number 11. Here are a few other hints to give the digital oscillators just a little more analog-like imperfections and character. That previous patch is a good start to make the raw waveforms a little bit brighter and more authentic to analog oscillators. This next one is also pretty subtle. On many of the iconic old analog synthesizers, the filter resonance knob never actually went all the way down to 0. There was a slight bit of resonance even when the knob was turned all the way down. That way there could be something going on during the entire travel of the knob with no slight dead area at the bottom when nothing happened. It gave an almost imperceptible extra sweetness to patches that supposedly had no resonance at all. When you're using a patch that has some filter action going on and is supposed to have no resonance, you could turn up the resonance parameter up to 3 or 4 rather than the traditional 0. As a side application of that, if there's no filter being used in your patch, you can tune your filter a lot higher in frequency so that the slightly resonant peak accents only the very highest frequencies in the sound. That can depend on what waveform you're using and has to be fine-tuned by ear. Don't use too much resonance or it just sounds goofy. So our low-pass filters can literally make the waveforms brighter. But don't expect anything from the more boring waves like sine and junk like that. One thing that was universally noticed when digital oscillators first arrived was their somewhat sterile-sounding flawless pitch, that was generally thought of as being less natural and less desirable when compared to the slightly different tunings between the different voices in the earlier polysynths. One technique I like is to very subtly use LFOs at their slowest speeds on 1 or 2 of the oscillator's pitches. Be sure you leave the LFO resets off to keep it random. I like to use these LFOs at an L1 level of 15 to keep the effect minimal at the lowest modulator settings on the oscillator page. The older analog synthesizers frequently also had slightly imperfect interval adjustments, so like one C note was not quite perfectly in tune with a higher or lower C note. You can vary slightly at the keyboard parameter to an oscillator's pitch, either positive or negative, to duplicate that particular imperfection. Try to keep it subliminal, we're going for more of a feeling than an obvious effect. And you may need to retune your oscillator again to the correct pitch, just like it was when those original analog instruments were tuned up. Pay special attention to the higher notes, since pitch errors are more obvious up there. See if you think all those make this patch sound more like vintage analog than what you typically hear from digital instruments. Number 12. Vector synthesis fades between 2 or more waveforms. The easiest method we can use on our synthesizers is to fade an oscillator in or out at its DCA while another oscillator's DCA is doing exactly the opposite. You need to try and balance the DCA initial volume setting with modulator amount so that ideally in the middle of the change you have both oscillators sounding together, and at either extreme you only hear one. This example continually vectors between 2 waveforms by an LFO. This patch uses the mod wall combined with the mod pedal. Number 13. You can get this sound on our synthesizers by combining different techniques, but that can get really involved, and creating one here from scratch would take a very long time. So I'll just give you a very short demo patch to type in for yourself that shows you a couple of ideas for making this kind of sound. And here's a finished example from one of my patch sets that combines LFOs, envelopes, alternate waveforms, and also layering to create the sound of a lot of different sequencing waveforms. A fun way to be a total rotter is to sequence a bunch of different waves in your sequencer, then play along with it while pretending you're doing the whole thing entirely from your keyboard. This one uses sustained sounds from the keyboard and may sound a bit familiar to some of you. So what do you consider to be more important, the path you travel or the destination? Number 14. Using amplitude modulation could take up many videos. Of course there are the traditional inharmonic applications such as bells and Doctor Who sweeps. But that's only the beginning. A. Cross-wave synthesis through AM. Some of the SQ-80 transient attack samples actually merge with the sustaining waves a little more interestingly if you activate AM. Here's one example combining the LYNX transient in oscillator 1 with a sine wave in oscillator 2. First without AM, and then with AM. Due to those operating system quirks, not all combinations work. Some get confused and sound like rancid puke. Experiment to see which ones you like. B. Detuning for a Leslie effect. Here's a technique I actually got out of the Yamaha DX7 owner's manual. I'm using AM with slightly detuned waveforms which combine to sound a bit like a Leslie effect. Here's the patch played before and after the AM is turned on. Not exactly the same as what you'd get with FM, but definitely related. See? The AM function can really get strange with the pulse waveform. When it's tuned way low and the pitch is kept moving, it can give a unique sort of ambient sound which is made even more spacey with AM. Using pulse is like using one of the noise waveforms except that it changes pitches smoothly without aliasing. I first learned about that from the Technosis patch sets that were programmed by Mike Peake. This one is named Chamber. Then I adapted that technique for one of my patches imitating a classic science fiction sound effect. This one waveform opens up a whole new world of programming possibilities, and most of that experimentation has yet to be done. D. We can use AM to create all new waveforms. Here are a few examples of woodwind instrument tones made from just 2 sine waves and no filtering. Without any of the technical explanation from Transoniq Hacker issue 68, here are the sine waves in unison. They sound the same as one sine wave. Now I switch on AM, changing it to more like a flute tone as the AM effect generates a harmonic. If we raise oscillator 1 an octave higher, it sounds more like a recorder or a filtered square wave. If we raise oscillator 1 another octave higher, it sounds brighter, more like a clarinet. This time we go back to unison oscillators and raise oscillator 2's sine wave an octave. It gets closer to the tone of a mellow double reed instrument. Then if we raise oscillator 2 another octave, it sounds like a brighter and more nasal double reed instrument. Odds bodkins. This really isn't all that far removed from how sounds are created on an FM synth. With some less cooperative waveforms, especially on the SQ-80, using AM gives peculiar and sometimes non-musical sounds. Due to the quirks in the operating system, for those specific accursed waveforms it goes looking for waves in all the wrong places, just like the hidden waves. Early on, one particular sound was dubbed the AM bug and became popular for its awkward rhythmic beat. But many other sounds can be gotten from this inexplicable oddness. Both good, bad, and ugly. Number 15. AM is not the only way to come up with completely new waveforms on these instruments. There are those who have said that these Ensoniqs are inferior because they don't include a white noise generator. But on page 28 of the ESQ-1 manual and page 34 of the SQ-80 manual it shows how to turn any of the oscillators into one. Here's the noise 2 waveform in its natural state. And now I'm taking an LFO triangle wave at its maximum frequency, and then turning it up to full blast on the pitch of the oscillator. There you have it, pure white noise, all ready to make a patch with. And here I'm filtering it down into pink noise. Wow! The sync effect is extremely useful in generating a whole new world of alternate waveforms. There are actually two different sync effects, the more famous one with synced oscillator 2 tuned higher than reference oscillator 1 where you can get those classic sync lead tones that share some properties in common with the wah-wah effect. Then there's the other one that we're talking about here, where oscillator 2 is tuned lower than oscillator 1, so you can get a smaller percentage of the waveform to loop. For just one example, here's the versatile noise 2 waveform and a few of the many alternate waveforms it can be made into. And for another example, the sine wave that normally has no harmonics can be made very bright. See? If you move the pitch of oscillator 2 while it's synced and tuned lower than oscillator 1, you'll end up valmorphizing the shape of the waveform at a constant pitch. All the pitch parameters now turn into waveform parameters. Due to those operating system quirks, a few of the waveforms just go completely loony when you try syncing them, and sound more like the AM bug, which could be either good or bad depending on your mental state. Finding out which waveforms do what could keep you busy for years. Pulse width modulation is probably the most classic example of moving waves, and has been explained in a previous video and in Transoniq Hacker number 85. Here are a few demo examples of that completely unrelated pulse waveform being morphed. And here are a few finished patches based on moving waves. If you use the formant waveforms as moving waves, you're changing their formant frequency. To give you some idea of their versatility, here's a formant 3 moving wave sound that modulates the formant frequency by an LFO for the classic wah-wah sound without using the filter. Here's a formant 4 patch that changes its formant frequency by the mod wheel. Here's one featuring the formant 5 wave modulated by an envelope. The vocal waveform can also shift its more complex formant frequencies in a similar fashion. But morphing waveforms isn't the only way to do moving formants. You can also modulate the frequency of the resonant filter. The wah-wah pedal patch is a simple example. If you combine 2 of those filters you can get some really gnarly vocal effects. Here's a layered patch that combines resonant filters that the mod wheel moves in opposite directions. And you can even send moving formant waveforms through the moving formant filter for some crazy vocalizations. This is actually a really big subject. The possibilities are endless. But this video isn't. So I hope I've given you a new idea or two. Catch you on the flip-flop. Bye!